You know when I first realized Henry was cheating on me? It was a Wednesday evening in 1979. I was ironing his shirt, the blue one with the small check pattern, the very one he wore to those work dinners. And suddenly I smelled it. Not his cologne, not the tobacco he'd carried around with him since he was 20. No. It was perfume. Soft, sweet, sticky, like jam on a pillow. And it wasn't mine. I froze, the iron in my hand, and thought, she's younger. That's what came first for some reason. Not he betrayed me. Not, how could he? But, she's younger. And you know what the scariest part was? I wasn't surprised. Henry was a handsome man. Not in that movie star way. Not Brad Pitt. But the kind women in small American towns liked. Tall, strong, with straight teeth and thick hair. He always knew how to charm, especially the cashiers at the grocery store and the waitresses at the diner. I used to think it was just politeness. You know, flirting. Nothing serious. We all do it when we're young. And then I realized he thrived on it. We got married in '66. I was 23, he was 25. I was teaching elementary school back then, and he had just started at the insurance company. We rented a tiny house. The furniture was from the junkyard, but I was happy. I believed our marriage was the beginning of a long road, together through thick and thin. I didn't know the joy would be short-lived, and the sorrow would last for 30 years. The first few years were, well, like everyone else's. We worked, saved, argued over the garbage and pizza without anchovies. Then Susie was born, our first. 2 years later, Jonathan. Henry adored the children, especially when they were quiet and asleep. He'd play with them on Sundays and call himself the best dad in the county. I tried too. I baked him cherry pies, mended his socks, bought the lotion he liked. I tried to be the perfect wife. Because back then, in the '70s, they told us, a happy marriage is a woman's achievement. If your husband leaves, it means you didn't hold on tight enough. I remember in 1978 we had a fight. A big one. About his late nights at work. That was the first time I asked, is there someone else? He looked at me like I was crazy. You're jealous? Of me? I'm your husband, Ellen. And I felt like a fool. A paranoid wife who was imagining things. He had a way of doing that, making me doubt myself. But the smell of perfume was real. Just like the thin, light-colored hair on his jacket. And the text message I accidentally saw when he forgot his phone at home. Don't forget, tomorrow at 3. Wear that tie I love smile. I sat in the kitchen, clutching the phone, and my heart was pounding somewhere in my throat. And you know what I did? Nothing. I put the phone back and baked an apple pie. Because the neighbors were supposed to come over that evening. You're probably thinking, why didn't I leave? Why didn't I scream? Throw his suitcase onto the porch? I've asked myself that question 100 times. And every time I answered differently. In that moment, out of fear. Later, out of habit. And even later, because I stopped believing I deserved better. It's hard for a woman in a marriage to admit she's lost. Especially when there are children, a mortgage, when the whole town knows you as the perfect couple. I thought, well, he always comes home anyway. He didn't leave her for good. Maybe it's just a phase. But it wasn't a phase. It was a system. A way of life. You know, I carried that truth inside me for so long, as if it were my fault. He'd smile at me in the morning, ask if we were out of eggs, tell me how he got held up with a client yesterday. And I'd nod, make him an omelet, and watch him tie his tie. That very tie. I started noticing little things. His shirts didn't smell the same. There were strange hairs on the pillow. Sometimes he'd come home with faint lipstick stains on his collar. He had a new confidence about him. Even his walk changed. He started straightening his shoulders and looking in the mirror longer. One day, I finally couldn't take it anymore. It was late autumn. I was baking a pumpkin pie. Our town had a contest at the Methodist church. Susie was doing her homework at the kitchen table. Jonathan was playing Monopoly with a friend. Henry walked in and tossed his jacket on a chair. I went up to him, put my hand on his chest, and said, "Henry, I know." He froze at first. Then he smiled. "Know what, Ellen? What do you know?" "Everything. For a long time now. I just didn't want to say anything." He sat down, rubbed his face with his hands, and then said, "It doesn't mean anything. It's just foolishness. You understand? Male foolishness. But it doesn't mean anything. It's just foolishness. You understand? Male foolishness." And that's when I saw him for the first time, truly. Not my husband, not the father of my children, but a man who was comfortable living in my belief in him, and who had no intention of changing. After that conversation, he became more careful. Less careless, that's probably more accurate. Got a second SIM card. Started washing his own clothes. Even bought a second deodorant and kept it in the car. But I already knew. I knew everything. And then something strange happened. I stopped being afraid. I no longer waited for his calls. Didn't sniff his collars. Didn't look for restaurant receipts in his wallet. I started living as if his affairs were just background noise. Like rain outside the window. It falls, but you're under the roof. It's cold, but you're wearing a sweater. I laughed with the kids. I went back to teaching. I even started knitting. Terribly, crookedly, but with pleasure. I went to visit my friend in Knoxville. We sat on the porch, drank lemon tea, and talked about flowers, as if I wasn't married to a man who betrayed me every Tuesday and Friday. And then something happened that I least expected. He started getting jealous. One day, he saw me laughing with Jonathan's classmate's father, Tom. A good man, widowed young. He came to pick up his son and stayed for coffee. We were chatting about the weather, and Henry came home early from work and found us on the porch. He came over, shook Tom's hand, and was on edge the whole evening, and then at night, suddenly asked, "Were you flirting with him?" "Henry," I said, "aren't you one to talk?" He fell silent. For the first time, I saw fear of losing me in his eyes, not because he loved me, but because I had suddenly stopped being convenient. You know what it's like to feel like you're just background noise in someone's life? I lived like that for 30 years. I was his home, the mother of his children, the wife for society. And all the real, living, sharp things, he took to others, and I allowed it. Because I believed in duty, in family, in what was right. But one day, when Susie was 22, she brought her boyfriend home. His name was Mark. He was sweet, with an anchor tattoo on his arm. I immediately noticed the way he looked at her, with respect, admiration, love. And then I broke. I went up to Henry that evening, when he was polishing his shoes in the garage, and said, "You know what I want for our daughter?" He didn't look up. "What?" "For her never to live the way I have. Never." He froze. "Ellen." "Don't interrupt. I want her man to look at her as if she's the sun, not a kitchen chair. For her not to forgive cheating. And for her not to be afraid to leave." He didn't answer, just sighed. Like a man who didn't expect I could still feel. And if you've listened to this point, thank you truly. At our age, when everything seems already lived, it's so important for someone to just hear you. If you're interested in hearing other stories from my life, you can subscribe to this channel. I'm here, my grandchildren call me Grandma Ellie, and for you, I'm just an old woman with a pile of memories in her heart. When Henry was diagnosed, he was 59. He always looked younger, took care of himself, ate well, did exercises in the morning. Even his medical chart was almost perfect, except for high blood pressure. So when the doctor called me and said it was cancer, lung cancer, stage 4, I didn't believe it at first. I remember holding the phone and looking out the window. Children were riding their bikes. Summer had just begun. Everything seemed so normal, and only in my chest did it suddenly become empty. Not from horror, not from anger, but from something inevitable. He came home that day as if nothing had happened. Put his suitcase on the floor, kissed me on the cheek, and went to take a shower. And I just stood in the kitchen thinking, I know, and he doesn't know yet that I know. When he finally sat down at the table, I served him potato casserole, like I always did on Thursdays. He ate in silence. Only when he pushed his fork aside did he say, "Is there something you want to say?" I nodded. The doctor called. He wasn't surprised. "Well?" "You have cancer." He said it's too late. I didn't cry. I just watched him turn pale. "You're kidding," he mumbled. "You're kidding." I silently shook my head. He stood up, walked to the window, stood there for 10 minutes, not moving. The next few weeks were like a fog. Doctors, hospitals, tests. He lost weight. His face became gaunt. He spoke little, and I took care of him, like a child. No one understood why I was still around. His mistresses disappeared one by one, as if they had evaporated. Friends called less and less often. Colleagues from the office sent flowers and didn't show up again. And I made him chicken broth, changed his sheets, rubbed lotion into his aching legs. I didn't do it out of love, and not out of duty. I did it because I didn't want him to die alone. One night, when he became very ill, he asked for water. I held the glass to his lips. He took a sip, and with difficulty whispered, "Why are you doing all this?" I looked at him. "Because you're the father of my children. Because I loved you once. And now," I sighed. "Now I'm just a person. And a person doesn't abandon another person at the edge." He cried. For the first time in 30 years, real tears. A month later, he was gone. It was a hot morning. I sat by his bed and held his hand. He passed away just like that, silently, peacefully, looking at the ceiling. And at that very second, I felt as if something heavy had been torn from my soul. As if I had carried a stone inside me for 3 decades, and now it was gone. But you know what? It wasn't freedom. It was empty. As if I had built my whole life around a person who was constantly somewhere not with me. And suddenly, that person was gone. And I was left. With all of this. After the funeral, a woman approached me. Medium height, brunette. She was holding a bouquet of roses. I didn't know her. "Excuse me," she said. "I couldn't not come. I knew Henry." I just nodded. She hesitated. "I was seeing him, many years ago. Forgive me if this is inappropriate." I looked her in the eyes. For a long time. And then suddenly hugged her. Not because I had forgiven, but because we had both been deceived. Only I, in marriage, and she in a lie. A few weeks later, I found his old box in the basement. There were letters in it. Not to me. To them. 2 different women. I read them all. Letter after letter. In each one, tender words. Confessions. Plans. And then, somewhere at the end, silence. He disappeared from their lives as easily as he had entered. And then I understood. I wasn't special. I was one of many. And that hurt more than the affairs themselves. But you know what I did? I burned those letters. Not out of revenge. Not out of anger, but because I no longer wanted to be a shadow in his life. I wanted to finally start living my own. After the funeral, I slept on the sofa. Our shared bed, I made it up neatly and never touched it again. The sheet smelled of his medicine, his skin, something metallic, like from hospital drips. I'd go in there during the day, to dust, open the window, straighten the pillows. But I couldn't sleep there. Not because I missed him, but because that bed didn't just hold us. It held all the lies of those 30 years. Sometimes it seemed to me that at night he would be about to come into the bedroom, like before, after a trip to a client, and ask if our water heater was acting up. And I would say again, no, it seems fine, even though inside everything would be churning. But now he wasn't coming in, and he wouldn't say anything more. Susie came in the 3rd week after the funeral. She stood in the doorway with the face adult children wear when they visit an aging mother, with caution and guilt, as if they should have come sooner. I remember her taking off her coat, sitting on the sofa, and saying, "Mom, how are you?" And I suddenly realized I didn't know. How was I? I didn't know because all this time I had only been thinking about him. About him, about the children, about how to behave decently, how not to air our dirty laundry. And myself, I had lost myself somewhere between the 2nd pregnancy and the last farewell smile at the coffin. Tired, I said, just very tired. Susie nodded and hugged me, and I cried for the first time for real. Not from pain, not from resentment, but because I was allowed to be weak. That same night, we sat in the kitchen, drinking tea. I watched her cut a sliver of lemon and thought, tell her, just tell her. Because I needed someone, anyone, to know what my life had really been like. Susie, I began, I need to tell you something about your father. She froze, the knife in her hand, and just nodded. I told her everything, not in detail, she didn't need to know that, but honestly. About the mistresses, about the years of silence, about the emptiness, about how I knew everything and still stayed. She listened silently, and then said, "Mom, I knew." I didn't believe her. "What did you know?" "I saw you crying at night. I heard you arguing. And once, I was still a teenager, I found a letter. From some Sharon." I started to tremble. "Why didn't you say anything?" I whispered. "Because you didn't say anything. I thought you were stronger than that. And then I realized. You just chose not to destroy things." After that conversation, everything changed between us. We became closer. She no longer looked at me as Mom, who has everything under control. She looked at me as a woman who had been through hell, but remained human. And at some point I realized, maybe it wasn't all for nothing. Maybe I didn't save a marriage, but her belief that family isn't always about perfection, but about a choice. Every day. Even when it's hard. Even when one loves and the other betrays. 6 months passed. I sold the house. Yes, our old bright house where we raised our children, where there was a dent in the staircase from Jonathan's first bicycle and marker stains on the bedroom wall. I put it up for sale. Because it wasn't my home anymore. It was our past. And I suddenly wanted to have something that was just mine. I moved to a small house by the lake. White facade, a porch with a swing, a rose garden. No one had lived there before me. Not a single story, not a single whisper in the walls. I started from scratch, at 71. I started drinking coffee on the porch in the mornings again, listening to radio plays. Writing. Yes, I wrote short stories for the local newspaper. People read them, thanked me. One woman wrote that my story helped her leave her abusive husband. And I laughed, to myself. Because I had left too late myself. but I had still left, if only in spirit. And then one day, in spring, a neighbor approached me. His name was Martin. He had been widowed 3 years ago, tended his garden as if the whole world depended on it. "Good morning, Mrs. Ellie," he said. "Would you mind if I offered you some strawberries?" I smiled. "I'd love to." He handed me a woven basket. "And if you ever want to have tea on the porch, just know I'm here." I agreed. Not right away. A couple of weeks later. We drank tea. He spoke little. But he looked me in the eyes. Truly. And I suddenly realized I hadn't broken. I could still feel, trust, be interesting, be alive. Even after 30 years of marriage where everything was about him, and not about us. Several months passed, and I realized I no longer wanted to be just mom, wife, or the one who endured everything. I wanted to be a woman. With real feelings, with real desires, with a real life. And so I allowed myself to fall in love again. Martin and I started seeing each other. Not right away. He was cautious, like someone who had lived alone for too long. But he didn't rush, didn't pressure me. He was just there. And at some point, I felt his attention, attentive, calm, without pretense, become something important to me. I still remember the day he told me we could go to the mountains. It was his suggestion. I had never been to the mountains, and Martin said that place would give me strength. He wanted to show me a new life. We went to a small resort town in the mountains. He had a little house there, with a fireplace and a view of the forest. In the evening, we sat by the fire and just were silent. I looked at his face, at the wrinkles that had appeared on his forehead and thought, this man has survived his losses, and now he's not afraid to open up. I wasn't ready to say I loved him. It was too fast. But I realized I was ready to be with him, to share space, atmosphere, days. A few weeks later, Martin suggested something else to me. He said, "Ellie, I want you to know, I understand you're scared. I feel it. But I don't need you to promise anything. I just want you to be here. Not as a wife, not as a mother, but as a woman who decides what she needs in this life." I remember how difficult it was for me to say yes. After all, I had said yes so many times in my life and received nothing in return. But this moment was different. He wasn't asking me for anything. He just wanted me to be real. And so, 6 months later, I could already look at myself in the mirror and understand that I was no longer waiting. I wasn't waiting for approval, wasn't waiting for someone's apologies. I no longer justified my actions. I was simply me. And I didn't need someone else to define who I should be. But the most important thing I realized was, despite everything that had happened, despite 30 years with Henry, I could be in love again. I could open up. Martin, with his presence, his attention, and his patience, helped me return to myself. But here's what I wasn't ready for. This is probably the hardest thing in life, to understand that the love you wait for might not be the way you imagined it. That you won't always get the perfect relationship. That even with those who are close to you, there can be their own torments, difficulties, illnesses. And that you might face deception again, but it will be your choice how to live with it. For a year or two, I put my relationship with Martin on the back burner. We continued to see each other, but I wasn't ready for more. I thought I needed time to understand what would happen next. And maybe I still needed a lot of time to understand that I could be enough on my own. But he didn't leave. He didn't demand much, didn't rush things. He continued to be there, just listening and living. That strange peace he gave me became what I had been looking for my whole life. It wasn't a storm of emotions, and it wasn't the fear of losing each other. It was simply the feeling that you could be together, without pretending and without being afraid that someone would leave. And then one day, when I was sitting on the porch watching the sunset, Martin came up to me with a cup of coffee and said, "Ellie, we're not eternal. But everything I've been through, everything you've survived, we didn't go through it for nothing. We can't make everything different. But I want you to know, you deserve to be happy." Then, for the first time, I told him, "I know, and I will be happy. I'm already learning how." We were silent for another minute, and then I went inside. Not because I didn't want to talk, but because I understood. I could be with him, and I could be with myself. Maybe at some point I will need more. Maybe I will again discover feelings that I once closed off. But right now, it's important for me to remember that despite everything, despite the years with Henry, despite the betrayals, despite the pain, I survived it. I was able to move on. And here's what I realized, sitting on that sofa with a cup of tea in my hands. No matter what we go through, we don't lose ourselves. We always remain ourselves, even if we change. Another 6 months passed. And then one day, sitting in my armchair by the window, I suddenly realized that the moment had come in my life when I was ready for a conversation. It wasn't just any conversation, but the kind I had avoided my entire life. I had to talk to the women he had been with. Those he spent so much time with, so often when I wasn't around. I met one of them. It happened by chance. Martin and I went to the city, to the market, for fresh vegetables. We were walking with our baskets, laughing, and suddenly, she saw me. I didn't immediately recognize her. The woman was my age, but her face seemed somehow familiar. But only when she came closer did I know her. It was Sharon. I didn't know she would be there. I didn't know she was still alive and well. But in that moment, when she looked at me, her eyes gave everything away. She recognized me too. "Ellie," she said. Her voice was quiet, but there was a certain tension in it. "I never thought I'd meet you." I remained calm, although there was so much going on inside. What should I say to her? What could I say? I didn't hate her, only a sense of wonder. "You didn't think?" I asked, surprised myself at how calm my voice sounded. "No," she replied. "I thought you knew everything." It was true. I knew. I had always known. But now, standing before her, I realized I didn't need to justify myself to her. It wasn't my fault he had betrayed me. Neither she nor he had made my choices for me. Sharon was silent. And then she tilted her head slightly, as if reconsidering something. She sighed and said, "I'm sorry, Ellie. I knew this would be hard for you someday. But he was stubborn. He couldn't find another way, and perhaps I could have answered with something bitter, something cruel. I could have expressed all my feelings. But instead, I simply replied, 'I understand. I forgive.' It wasn't relief. It wasn't forgiveness in the way people understand it. It was an understanding that I held no resentment, because what he did didn't matter to me anymore. I had decided to move on. After that meeting, I sat in the house for a long time, looking out the window and thinking, I forgive him, I thought. But maybe I was no longer forgiving myself for all those years when I was silent, when I said nothing, when I just wiped away tears and continued to pretend that everything was fine. Maybe I needed this realization to finally accept myself. Susie came to visit, and I told her about the conversation with Sharon. She sat across from me, listening, and seemed to be trying to understand what I had felt. "You did the right thing," she said. "It wasn't for him, it was for you." And perhaps she was right. One day, a month after that meeting, Martin brought me a new scarf. It was a scarf with a floral pattern. It was a delicate pastel shade, just what I liked. I took it in my hands and felt like it had become a part of my life again. "You know, I've been thinking a lot about you, Ellie," he said. "I'm not asking for much. I just want you to be happy." There was no fear or regret in his eyes, only quiet understanding. And perhaps there was something comforting in that. Because when you forgive for so many years, you stop demanding anything in return. You just accept. And in that acceptance, true freedom appears. Since then, I often walked alone. Sometimes I would go outside, sit on a bench, just watch the world and think, I am here, and this is my time. A time not to wait. A time not to be silent. A time not to build walls around myself. A time to open up. Open up to myself, to the world, and to all those who once seemed like strangers. And in that moment, sitting on the bench by the lake, I realized my life was in my hands again. Martin, Susie, Sharon, and even Henry, they all know this. But now all that matters to me is that I can go wherever I want and be with whomever I want. And maybe, one day, when I'm ready, I can tell someone else my story, the way it really was, without resentment, without regret. Just as the truth that helped me feel alive again. The day I was sitting on the porch, he came to me with a cup of tea and said, "Ellie, I need to talk to you." Several more months passed, and I had to face something I didn't want to think about again. But, as always in life, you can't avoid everything. I started asking myself questions. What would happen next? Martin was there, we continued to see each other, but he didn't rush things. He was quiet and patient, as if he knew I had to go through my own process. But at some point, I felt that the moment had come for me to start moving forward, without lingering in the past. I couldn't understand exactly what he wanted to say, but there was something important in his voice. He sat down next to me and was silent for a long time. During this time, I thought about many things, but especially about how he had been there. We had never talked about the past, about our fears and anxieties. I didn't know what was on his mind, and it became important to me. "I want you to know," he said, looking into my eyes. "I understand it's hard for you. I'm not asking you to change for me, I'm not asking you to be someone else. But I want you to give yourself a chance at happiness." And at that moment, I felt the heavy stones slowly slipping off my shoulders. I understood that happiness is not something someone else gives me. It's something I have to find within myself. Several days passed, and I decided that I needed to leave the past behind. I could no longer live with this pain and resentment. I decided that, despite everything that had happened in my life, I needed to learn to trust the one who is near, the one who deserves this trust. I went outside and felt how spring filled the air. The birds were singing, there was a lightness in the air. It was the moment when I decided that I would live not in the shadow of my past, but in the light of what I could create myself. So I came to a decision that changed a lot. Martin continued to be there, but I no longer felt that I needed to wait. I decided that I wanted my day to start with something new. I started meeting people, taking new steps, going where I hadn't dared to go before. I also realized that I didn't need to save anyone. I didn't need to save Henry. I didn't need to save Martin or anyone else. I could be there, but only when the most important woman in my life was me. One morning, I got up earlier than usual and went for a walk in the park. I didn't know that this day would change a lot. The park was quiet, cool, and the air was fresh. I walked slowly, enjoying the solitude. And suddenly I met a woman sitting on a bench. She was older than me, and her gaze was sad. We greeted each other, and I sat down next to her. We talked a little about how important it is not to be alone, how important it is to have support. I didn't know that this was exactly what I needed, just to talk to someone who could understand. And this woman told me how she had lost her sister, how she had gone through a divorce, and how she had come to the decision, not to look for the guilty, but to look for her own paths to happiness. She told me that everything in life is possible if we allow ourselves to believe in the best. These words sank into my heart. I realized that there was no point in holding on to pain, that I needed to learn to let go and move forward. At that moment, I understood that the time had come not only to forgive, but to start life anew. In the evening when I returned home, Martin was there again. He didn't say anything, just offered me a cup of tea. We sat in silence, but there was more than words in that silence. I understood that we didn't need words to understand each other. And at that moment I realized that life is not always about fixing or changing something. Sometimes it's just about accepting. Accepting yourself, accepting other people, and understanding that everything that happened also has meaning. Several more months passed. Each day became increasingly meaningful, and I began to feel something shifting within me. It was almost imperceptible, but if you had asked me when I last felt truly happy, I would have answered, now. Martin became less anxious, checked on me less often, and no longer tried to find excuses. I didn't know what it meant, but I felt lighter. Sometimes we spent entire evenings in silence, not demanding anything from each other, and it was okay. One summer, I decided to visit my sister. It was the first time I had gone alone, without Martin, without his gaze, without our usual conversations. It was something new for me. I hadn't seen my sister in a long time. She had always been there, but somehow always seemed distant. When we were young, I often blamed her for not saving me from the life I had lived with Martin. But I knew she couldn't have changed anything. And maybe it was my own decision, not to see. She had always been there, but I was too proud to admit that I needed help. My sister greeted me warmly, as always, and we spent several days together, talking about everything. About life, about children, about what she had gone through after her husband's death. We laughed, we cried, but most importantly, we began to truly understand each other. One evening, sitting on the porch, my sister said to me, "You know, Ellie, you've been through a lot, but you've never allowed yourself to be free." I didn't immediately understand her words, but later, when I thought about it, I realized. That was exactly it. I had always held on to fears, resentments, and pain. Even when I didn't need to, I was afraid to let go, afraid to live without what was familiar. And now, with each passing day, I understood more and more. There was no need to look for excuses, no need to live in the shadows. I just needed to be myself. When I returned home, I felt like I had come a long way. Martin was still there, but his eyes were different. He no longer tried to atone for his guilt. He simply lived with me. As if we were truly partners, not looking for salvation, but looking for what made us happy. And maybe that was the truth, that you don't always need to change everything. Sometimes it's enough to just be real. I couldn't help but remember all those moments when I was silent, when I didn't dare to say a word, how afraid I was to be honest. I was afraid to admit to myself that I deserved to be happy, despite everything that had happened. Yes, I had made mistakes, but I wasn't obligated to live with those mistakes my whole life. Mistakes are not a sentence, but an experience. But every time I closed my eyes and remembered how Martin would come home with apologies, or how his voice sounded with concern, I realized that perhaps he had changed too. He had become a different person. Not only because I had changed, but also because he had realized that happiness doesn't come through excuses. It comes through the present, through the simple acknowledgement that we were both imperfect, but we could be happy if we wanted to. But there was a moment when I realized it was time for me to meet again with what I had avoided my whole life, myself. I began to feel the need again to be independent, truly free. I needed to find time to focus on myself, my desires, and dreams that I had suppressed for years. And then one day, sitting on a bench in the park, I realized that I had a chance to take my next step. Perhaps I could travel alone again, do what I enjoyed. No obligations, just freedom. At that moment, I felt myself being freed from everything that had been holding me back. And it was something new, something incredible. I don't want to talk too much about the future, because I realize that the future is not something we build for tomorrow. The future begins with what we do here and now. And maybe for someone, it will just be a walk in the park. For me, it was the moment when I was able to love myself again, and understand that I deserve everything I dream of. Now, after all these years, I can say that I am ready for a new life, ready to be happy. I never would have thought that at my age I would be searching for my path again, but when I sat in silence, contemplating everything that had happened, I realized I needed to live not only for others, but also for myself. Life is too short to give up what makes you happy. And the most important thing I've learned over these years is that happiness doesn't come from the outside. It starts within us. Martin, when I spoke to him frankly, said that he was ready to support my decisions, whatever they might be. It was surprising. He didn't try to hold me back, didn't try to change my mind. He accepted me as I was, with my experiences, with my history, and that gave me even more strength. When we spent time together, we were both different. We no longer tried to justify our mistakes. We didn't hide behind phrases like, "Everything will be okay." We started talking about what really mattered. About how each of us had walked our own path, and on that path there had been not only joys, but also a lot of pain. I realized that I couldn't stay in one place, that I couldn't just wait. Time was passing, and I couldn't allow myself to miss it, as I had missed it before. I started traveling alone. Not right away, of course, but every step was important. At first, I went to small towns where there was no one I knew. It was all new to me. I wasn't used to being alone. But gradually, I learned to find joy in solitude, not to fear it. I began to notice small things that had previously seemed insignificant to me. How the leaves rustled under my feet, how the scents of flowers filled the air, how people in these towns smiled and spoke to you, even if you were just a passerby. And it was incredible. I began to appreciate every moment. I realized that I no longer wanted to return to the closed circle that I had created for myself. I was no longer afraid to be open, not afraid to be vulnerable. Over time, I returned to old hobbies that I had once abandoned. I started writing. Yes, I was an old woman, but suddenly I realized that I had so much to convey. I couldn't just hide all those memories, feelings, and experiences. I realized that I wanted to share them with the world. I started keeping a diary, writing letters to people I had once known. I wrote several short stories about the times when I was younger. And you know what? It brought me incredible relief. I began to look at my life from a different perspective. I realized that the moments I had considered lost were actually important lessons. All these experiences were necessary to bring me to who I am now. One day, I was sitting at the table, flipping through old photographs. I suddenly realized how many people in my life, whom I had once considered lost, had now become part of my story. I thought about Henry, about how he had entered my life, and how I had allowed myself to believe that he would change me, make us both happy. I remembered how his actions poisoned my days, but I still stayed. I forgave him again and again because it seemed to me that it was my duty. But now, when I looked back, I realized that I couldn't blame only him. I was also part of that story. I didn't leave him because I was afraid to be alone. I couldn't find the strength within myself to be honest with myself and with him. I continued to live out of habit, although emptiness grew inside me. Now, after so much time has passed, I understand that forgiveness is not just words, not just phrases about how we should forgive. Forgiveness is a process that begins within us. It is the ability to let go of resentments and pain without expecting anything in return. And only when we truly forgive can we move forward. Martin, when we spoke frankly, said, "Ellie, I love you. And I need you to know that I am proud of how you have changed." I thought about his words. I didn't know if I could accept his love, but at some point, I realized that love is not something that can be obtained by right. It is something given with a willingness to accept, no matter what happens. I began to build a new life, unburdened by fears. I began to discover new horizons, new activities, and even new relationships with people I met along the way. It was a journey in the truest sense of the word, a journey on which I learned to be myself, not to depend on others' decisions, not to expect someone to change my life. I learned to be grateful. Grateful for every morning, for the opportunity to start over, for every step I took towards myself. One day, I again met the woman I had talked to in the park when I first began to change my attitude towards life. We sat on a bench and she said, "Ellie, you've changed. You look like you've finally found your way." I smiled, and at that moment, I realized she was right. I had found a path that began with accepting myself. And it was the most important path in my life. I don't know what awaits me ahead, but I'm not afraid anymore. I will move forward, discovering new horizons, building a life in which I will be happy. And perhaps, someday, I will meet someone who will also be ready to move with an open heart, ready to accept and forgive. When I realized that the time had come to share my story with other people, I understood that to do this, I needed to step over everything I had once hidden, even from myself. We often think that our mistakes and experiences are something that should remain in the shadows, closed off to everyone. We try not to show our weaknesses, because society says we need to be strong, that we need to keep everything inside. But what I've realized with age is that our strength lies in vulnerability. I understood that every person I meet is going through their own difficulties, their own pain, their own resentments. And if I continued to keep my feelings to myself, I wouldn't be able to help other people, wouldn't be able to give them what my story could give. I started writing. Writing not about how beautiful my life was, but about how difficult it was to be honest with myself, how difficult it was to let go of people who were once important to me, but could no longer stay in my life. I wrote about how I learned to forgive, and about how I learned to live with the mistakes that once oppressed me. I can't say that my path was easy. There were days when I wanted to give up, when it was hard for me. There were moments when I heard his voice in my head again and again, felt it all weighing down on me. But I realized that if I didn't let go of this pain, I would never be able to move forward. I would never be able to find my place in this world. When I started sharing my story with others, I felt the pain release me. It wasn't instantaneous, but with each story, I became more and more free from what held me in the past. I wasn't living to prove something to someone. I wasn't living for praise or approval. I learned to live for myself. And that was the most important lesson in my life. In my years, I realized that every moment is a chance to change your life. I realized that it's not too late to start something new, not too late to love and be loved, not too late to live the way I want to. And I know that I don't need to look for happiness in the outside world. Happiness lives within us, and it begins with accepting ourselves, with forgiving our mistakes, and with understanding that every pain, every breakup, every loss is just part of the journey. I'm no longer angry at Martin. I no longer blame him for what happened between us. I know that I was also part of that story. I forgive him because I understand. Forgiveness is not for him, but for me. It's the liberation I give myself, not him. Now, when I look back, I see not only mistakes, but also moments that brought me joy. I see people who became part of my life, despite all the difficulties. I see moments of laughter, kindness, and love that I once considered insignificant. And I realize that each of these moments was important. Life goes on, and I continue to live. Perhaps I am no longer the woman I once was, but I am proud of who I have become. And if you, dear reader, are listening to me now, know this: you don't need to be someone else. You don't need to look for happiness in someone else's eyes. Happiness begins with you. With how you look at the world and how you look at yourself. If you have ever thought that it's too late to change something, then I can tell you one thing: it's never too late. Every day is a new chance. A chance to become who you have always wanted to be. And although I don't know what awaits me ahead, I know that I will move forward, with an open heart and with a willingness to accept everything that life offers me. This is my story, and I am proud that I was able to share it with you. I want to thank everyone who has been with me in this moment. Thanks to you, I found the strength to open up, tell my truth, and move forward. Perhaps your story is similar to mine. And if so, I hope that it will also help you find your way. Don't forget, we are all unique. We all deserve happiness. And no one can take away our right to be happy, except ourselves. For now, my dears, I will live my life, enjoy every day, and remember that forgiveness and love are what can change everything. End of story. This has been Ellie, the woman who went through fire and water but did not lose her soul. I hope this story has helped you see how important it is not to stop, despite all the difficulties. If you found something useful in my words, don't forget to subscribe to the channel to hear more stories. And remember, the most important things are love and belief in yourself.